Hello everyone. Welcome to the lecture on habits of mind and the rhetorical triangle. This week we'll be looking at two different sections coming from your textbook, the first on academic habits of mind and the second on the rhetorical triangle. Just to let you know, our textbook is created for a face-to-face classroom. It has a great deal of good information about writing and how to do academic research, which is why I chose it for this class. But since it's directed towards a face-to-face audience, sometimes the material in it is less appropriate for our type of interface. For that reason, I've given you page numbers to read each week, but what I'll do is take the information and within the lecture, I'll translate it so that it makes more sense for our online course and for the way that we're learning how to do our research, which is a little different than a traditional classroom. So for that reason, you'll notice in some places that I'm talking about sections of the book that you're reading, and I'm not asking you to do some of the longer readings where they give examples. And you'll see that happen throughout the course of the semester. So just note the page numbers on your weekly assignment sheets and just read those particular pages, which will always correspond to the lecture. Another thing that you'll notice in the textbook is that it contains many different types of assignments. You do not need to do the assignments unless I specifically instruct you to do so. I'll always tell you on the weekly assignment sheet if I'm going to ask you to respond to one of the assignments that are in the textbook. Many times they'll use sample essays within the book, and then their examples of how to apply some of the different strategies will ask you to do writing assignments or to work in groups. And those assignments are not necessarily ones that we're going to complete. So just be sure that as you're reading, that you're paying attention to the page numbers that I assign specifically on the assignment sheets, and that you're not completing any of the assignments unless I've instructed you to in that assignment sheet. And if you ever have questions about whether or not to do an in-text assignment, please do email me. We're going to begin by talking about academic habits of mind. Your book instructs you that good research begins by developing these habits of mind, and they've given 5. Habits of mind are patterns of thought that lead us to question assumptions, explore alternatives, anticipate opposing arguments, compare experiences, and identify the causes and consequences of ideas and events. Essentially, this means taking on analytical perspective whenever you're doing your research or whenever you're doing your own writing. So we've talked about analysis in terms of media literacy, but for an overall definition of analysis, what that is breaking something down into its various parts and reflecting on how those parts do or don't work together. That's what we're going to be doing throughout the course of the semester as we look at the images of popular culture in the media, as we look at different types of sources and figure out how to evaluate good sources, and as we put together research that will demonstrate your understanding of this particular social issue in popular culture. Analysis is a way for us to take things apart, to examine them, and to figure out how they work. Your textbook has given us 5 different skills that we can develop that will help us with learning how to have certain academic habits of mind. Here are the first 2. Number 1, you can learn to make inquiries. Every research project begins with an interesting question about the way the world works. And it really begins too with observation and with your own interests. So this semester, I'm going to be asking you to look at what your own habits are of consuming popular culture and what your own interests are in terms of media forms. I want you to start with where you are in terms of your personal interests and bring that into the research process. So a couple of ways to do that are to ask questions. Instead of taking for granted the popular culture media that you're consuming, we're going to be asking questions like why, how, do things have to be this way? We're also going to examine alternatives. Could things happen another way instead of the way that they are happening? So what you'll see throughout the semester is that we're going to return to this type of inquiry as we develop thesis sentences, topics for essays, brainstorming, and even as we're looking into research sources. Another skill that we can develop is seeking and valuing complexity. We want to avoid questions with either or answers. This is what the textbook describes as binary thinking. Complex issues are likely to have multiple explanations rather than a simple choice between A and B. So, examining an issue from multiple perspectives and multiple disciplines helps us to get a more well-rounded view, and it helps to complicate the issue. We can do this by reflecting on what we observe, looking at our issue from a variety of angles. And I'm going to ask you to do that later in the semester with the longer research essay, as we're talking about how to analyze popular culture in your media from more than one point of view. The next habits of mind begin with view writing as a conversation. Ideas always build on and respond to other ideas, and so you shouldn't think of the research and your interests as being isolated. Instead, you want to think of your interests and your research as responding to an ongoing conversation that's happening out in culture. You want to think of how you can respond to someone else's work, build on it, and then anticipate future responses. And one way to do that is to practice empathy. This means trying to understand how different viewpoints could be true and representing all sides fairly. So as we think about popular culture, you want to think about how those images and artists and icons and the people that you're studying and the sports or music videos or video games have a community around them. There are lots of people who participate in that community, and everyone has different opinions. So when you begin to research popular culture, you want to take into consideration the fact that people are already talking about those figures and those media sources, that you're going to participate in that conversation and anticipate what others might say in the future as well. This does take time, and that brings us to our next skill, understanding that writing is a process. Of course, you want to choose an idea that matters to you so that you can participate in that conversation, but you also need to be aware that learning what's going on in that conversation does take time. It will take time to develop your ideas through, first of all, collecting that information that can really accurately represent the conversation that's going on. Then you'll want to draft out your ideas to get things in order and then revise before you turn anything in. These are the basic steps to writing well, and as we go throughout the semester, we'll be looking at each one of those steps in a lot more detail. But just for now, remember that it does take time, so you want to plan that into your development as a writer. And then finally, the last habit of mind is reflection. Pausing, taking note of what you're doing, monitoring your own progress, that is what reflection is, and it will help you to evaluate what you have learned and what you still need to know. So one good skill to help with reflection is to make a plan. Rather than treating the research process like a last-minute endeavor, you should instead think through, here's what I need to find out, maybe even making a list, answering questions as you go, and then following that plan so that you can have time to think about whether you've accomplished everything you want to do as a writer and a researcher. As you develop these academic habits of mind, we'll be applying them specifically to your own writing throughout the course of the semester. The first writing assignment that we're going to do as a formal essay will be the ad analysis essay. So this is a little bit of an introduction to the concept of the ad analysis essay, and this week we're going to examine the rhetorical triangle, which will introduce you to the terms that you're going to be using in that essay. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that assignment sheet, it will be helpful for you to read over that now before you continue with the rest of the lecture, so that you understand how the terms that I'm introducing will eventually be used in your writing. A successful analysis paper will employ the rhetorical appeals of logos, ethos, and pathos to describe how the ad that you choose uses popular culture media to persuade the viewer. So keep that in mind throughout the rest of the lecture as I talk about these different concepts and as I refer to sections from your textbook on the rhetorical triangle. We're going to look now at some of the terms in composition studies that describe how persuasion works. The reason that we're doing this is as we look at the ad analysis essay, we want to have the terminology to describe how we're analyzing the different media that we're looking at. So in composition studies, rhetoric is the main term that you will hear to describe the art of persuasion. Essentially what rhetoric is an analysis of all the means of persuasion available in a given situation. So Aristotle wanted to look at, back in classical times, how were people who were giving speeches persuading people to their point of view. So he looked at what's called the rhetorical situation. Who is the speaker or creator? What is the purpose? And who is the audience? And he began to break down these different types of persuasion that the creator would use in order to affect the audience for different purposes. And in order to persuade, writers and speakers, he found, were using a combination of rhetorical appeals. Each appeal works to persuade in a particular way. And because there are three parts of the rhetorical situation, these have been developed now into what's called the rhetorical triangle. I've written the rhetorical triangle here with logos on top, ethos and pathos at the bottom, but that was just an arbitrary decision. You could see the rhetorical triangle diagrammed in any way. There's no one point that's more important than the other in terms of where it's placed on the triangle. It's just simply a visualization of how in every given rhetorical situation, all three of these things are typically present, working together in different degrees. So let's talk about what each one of these are. Logos appeals to the writer's logic through quotes from authorities, statistics, or examples. Ethos appeals to the creator's credibility through use of trustworthy sources, citations, or a person's public reputation, if they're trustworthy or not as a speaker. Pathos appeals to the viewer's emotions by trying to make the viewer, the audience, feel instead of think. So these three different ways are what we're going to look at in more detail throughout the rest of the lecture and what you'll be applying to your own writing and your own analysis throughout the course of the semester. One of the primary ways that we see the rhetorical appeals in action is in advertising. So I want you to think about your own experience of advertising, and these appeals will probably seem familiar. A product is sold through logos if facts or evidence, like 2 out of 3 people chose this product. If that is the way that the ad is presenting itself in order to convince, this is appealing to the viewer's logic, trying to make them feel that the logical conclusion is that the product is the best one to purchase. A product that is sold through ethos is really appealing to the product itself or to the creator as being trustworthy, stable, or reliable. Or the advertiser could also use ethos to appeal to a wilder side by promoting the product as adventurous, sexy, or challenging. So if you're really being persuaded through the reputation of the product itself, that is an appeal to ethos. A product is sold through pathos when the viewer's emotions are manipulated to feel something for the product or company. An advertiser might try to make viewers excited or angry or even sad about an issue or about the product in order to sell it. Remember that an effective argument employs all three appeals in varying amounts. So even though we can break them down into pathos, logos, or ethos, and an ad might rely more obviously on logos or more obviously on pathos, all three are typically present in order to be the most persuasive possible. So you yourself will practice these appeals as well as being able to identify them. And in 2 ways, we're going to be looking at them. Analyzing them as employed by other authors or creators, and then also using the appeals yourself in your own arguments. So as you begin to feel more comfortable with pathos, logos, and ethos, you can intentionally begin to incorporate those appeals into your writing. And the next few slides are going to discuss both how to identify these different appeals in even more detail, as well as how to employ them in your own writing. Let's start by looking at ethos. Ethos is persuasion based on the perception of the creator, company, or a celebrity's credibility. This appeal is generally considered to be the most important one because if the audience doesn't trust the creator, they won't buy a product or believe an argument. So you can imagine if the speaker of a speech or the celebrity in an ad or the company behind a particular argument isn't considered to be trustworthy, whatever that person is saying or selling is not going to be received by the audience. So ethos then considerably has more sway because it's the first test of persuasion, even before you get to logos or to pathos. Creators often will use celebrity reputations to appeal to viewers in ads, in particular, because they feel that that celebrity reputation will then reflect on their product, and that product gains that same sense of appeal to an audience who will then want to purchase it. So in the ad on this slide, notice how there is no logic and little emotion in this ad. The entire persuasive claim about Nike's soccer ball being the world's best ball is resting on Wayne Rooney, the celebrity's reputation as a player. He's literally handing the ball to you saying, this is the ball that I want you to have. So that perspective of him handing it to you as a viewer and his recommendation, he's not saying it out loud, but the words right beside him are saying, here is my recommendation for the world's best ball. Therefore, if I think it's the best, then you should think it's the best. So it's not really a very emotional appeal. It's not a logical appeal. It is completely based on ethos, persuading through our perception of whether or not he is a trustworthy speaker about this particular product. If you believe he's a great player, if you believe that his reputation means something, then you're going to trust that his recommendation about this product is a good one, and you might go out and purchase this ball. If you don't believe that his reputation is good, then you're going to say, why would I take this product? Why would I take your advice about this? And you won't purchase it. So ethos then is working to try to get you to believe the argument that this product is the world's best based simply on his reputation. As I mentioned, we're going to be looking at the rhetorical appeals from two different perspectives. First, being able to identify the rhetorical appeal in an advertisement or another type of text. We just discussed that on the last slide. Now I want you to switch and think about how appealing to ethos can happen in your own compositions. In this case, you are the creator. You are the speaker. So you need to be able to demonstrate your own good ethos to whoever you're trying to persuade. So your book identifies several different ways that you can do this. First, you can establish to your audience that you have good judgment. The way to do that is to identify a problem that's actually worth addressing. So if you're making an argument, you don't want to write about an issue that's already been closed to conversation, that's already generally agreed upon, and that doesn't really have any real weight in culture, and it's not really worth investigating anymore. You also want to write with your readers' best interests in mind. You want to ask, what do my readers need to know about this issue that they don't know already? So don't rely just on your knowledge, which might be specialized about a particular interest that you want to write about. Instead, you have to think about, what does the general public know, and how can I demonstrate that I'm writing with their best interests in mind? The next one is conveying that you are knowledgeable. You want to be able to demonstrate your research through references to other sources, which we'll talk more about when we get to the longer research paper. You also want to make sure that you show breadth in your research. What that means is that you're showing a wide range rather than a very narrow range of opinions and ideas about your topic. So you want to be accurate, and that helps convey that you're knowledgeable, and you want to incorporate that sense of accuracy, good judgment into what an audience might perceive about your character as a researcher. If you have sloppy research, if it's incredibly biased, if you don't go very much in depth, that demonstrates a bad ethos to your audience. Then your argument begins to fail because you're perceived as not trustworthy. Finally, you want to show that you understand and value complexity. To write and research inquisitively, you need to gather a variety of perspectives on your topic, not just support for your own argument. You want to ask, what questions remain about my topic and how can I answer them? And sometimes in your research, you may not answer every single question that you come up with. It may be that you want to focus more on one particular area, and that's okay. But you at least want to acknowledge the larger conversation surrounding your topic so that you can show that you do have that good judgment and that you do know about the broader issues surrounding a social issue or a pop culture icon or a particular advertisement. Whatever it is that you're talking about, you want to demonstrate that you understand the full conversation, and that helps your audience believe in what you have to say. They understand that you're not being biased, and even if you don't answer all their questions, you at least know that these questions exist and you've raised them and you're interested in finding the answers. So all of these things work together to help create your own sense of good ethos. And it really shows up in composition studies in a variety of ways, from, as I said, using good sources, from correct citations and grammar so people can clearly understand what you're saying, from having a good balance and not being biased. Any of these things can really contribute to developing a sense of ethos that will make you be a trustworthy creator, speaker, or writer. The next appeal we will examine is pathos. Remember that pathos is persuasion through the viewer's emotions. So we're shifting perspective from the creator's reputation to the audience's feelings. Using pathos can help motivate readers or viewers to action or convince them to buy a product. This appeal is frequently used in advertising, especially because in print or in video advertising, you're only getting the audience's attention for a very short time. So emotion is a way to draw people in very quickly and very effectively. Emotional appeals can include humor, fear, anger, love, pity, sexual desire, or guilt and shame. And those are just a few that might appear in a wide variety of different advertisements. So I've chosen the one here on the slide from Save the Children. Immediately your eye was probably drawn to the baby's face, which is expressing distress, causing an immediate reaction or connection to the child in the photograph. Then you see the words, "He's so sick, he could die before you get to work." So these words are intentionally chosen to work on your emotions. So the image combined with the words sick, die, and then the logo, Save the Children, work on the viewer's emotions to produce guilt, sympathy, and the possibility of action. So even though the product here is charity or a donation, pathos is still used to motivate the exchange of money. So this is a very clear example of how pathos works, but in many advertisements, the manipulation of emotions can even be more subtle and less obvious, but still incredibly effective. It can come through in the use of certain music, peppy songs to make you feel happy about a product, or sad songs to make you feel emotional or nostalgic. And all of these emotions then are associated with that particular product and hopefully from the advertiser's perspective lead to desire, either to help in the case of Save the Children or to purchase something in order to exchange that feeling with the actual item. Pathos is sometimes singled out of the rhetorical appeals as being the most manipulative one because it does work purposefully on people's emotions. But really, to be an effective arguer or to sell someone something, including ideas, you do have to engage the full person, their mind and their emotions. And this is something that you can learn to do intentionally in your own writing as you work through how the appeals can work in your own compositions. So the first thing that your book tells us about is that we can show that you know what your readers value. That is one way that pathos works. Consider what will make your readers react emotionally. So you don't want to have, as the book tells you, over-emotional language. You don't want them to overreact to your text. But at the same time, you want to think, what would make my reader feel angry or sad or happy about the particular issue that I'm writing about? Or how can I create a sense of bonding between myself as the creator and the reader or viewer of whatever I've created? How can I connect with them through their emotions? And then after you've answered that question, you begin building illustrations and examples that relate to that particular emotion that you're trying to generate. So when you support your argument, you want to purposely choose examples that are calculated to get your audience to react emotionally. And again, some people find this manipulative because it is working on emotions, but that is one of the great elements of persuasion. How can you get your viewers or your readers to feel? And choosing illustrations and examples that are purposely targeted towards those feelings is actually a very important part of persuasion. The number one way to do that this semester in your writing, the easiest way to do that, is to consider your tone. Tone is the use of language that communicates your attitude toward yourself, your material, and your readers. You can use things like specific keywords or phrases that will create a mood, and your readers will respond to that particular mood. But again, as I mentioned, you don't want to use loaded language, overblown, exaggerated, or offensive words or phrases or even images, as this has the opposite effect on your viewers. That will end up undermining your ethos because people will think that you're biased, that you're too extreme, and they'll stop listening to what you have to say. So it's a very delicate balance between choosing wisely emotional language that can help convey a sense of your argument versus choosing biased language that will actually put off your audience and make them not listen to you. So as you develop pathos in your own compositions, be thinking through your tone in particular and how it can affect your reader. The final rhetorical appeal is logos. Logos is persuasion based on facts, statistics, reasons, and evidence. Often this type of appeal includes numbers. It's easy to remember because this appeal is trying to make logical sense. So logos being the appeal to logic. It's trying to convince the viewer that choosing the product or adopting an argument is the most logical thing to do. If you look at this particular ad, you can see logos very prominently in the display of the number. Notice how the amount of each product is placed side by side. Literally, the chips are stacked in little rows there to demonstrate how you can eat more for less calories. So the one on the right-hand side is the one that's being sold as, look how many you can eat for this many calories. Doesn't it make logical sense that you would pick the one where you could eat more? That's what the ad is asking you to conclude. Then, in very small type underneath, they have each product's ingredients and statistics that are placed with it so the viewer can compare them, think through them, and make the logical conclusion that these pop chips are the best ones to buy. You can also notice, though, that the ad does contain some pathos appeal with words like less guilty, more pleasure, but those are really not as persuasive here as the statistics and the measurements and the numbers that are put there for you to see visually how much more logical it is to choose pop chips over the other ones. So logic and appeal to logos is always going to be using very prominently facts, statistics, or reasons to try to persuade. When you're using logos in your own compositions, it might seem like the easiest way to do that would be just to throw in some statistics and numbers to try to prove your point. But there's actually several ways that logos can appear in composition. Your book explains 3 of them. First, state the premises of your argument. A premise is an assumption that you expect your readers to agree with, a statement that is either true or false. It's important for you to state this very clearly because that way you can prove logically what your claim is and people will agree with you or disagree with you based on how persuasive your claims are. Stating the premise allows your readers to understand what you have found to be true and what you want to persuade them to accept. So that, for our purposes, will be our thesis sentences that we'll work on developing throughout the course of the semester. You can also use credible evidence. You can ask, can a reasonable person draw the same conclusions I did based on the evidence I am presenting? You want your evidence to be logical. That's the appeal to logos. And you support your premise with specific examples that allow your audience to follow your argument from point to point. Sometimes this does involve incorporating current and accurate numbers. You do want to make sure that they're current and that they're accurate, which does involve double checking them and cross-checking them across sources to make sure that they are verified by multiple people and not just a random thing. Numbers might include things like graphs, tables, statistics, or even expert opinions from sources that quote certain numbers. Also, credible evidence can just be expert opinions in general. It doesn't have to have actual numbers. If the logical appeal is being used, if you have multiple experts that are concluding a certain thing is true or false, you could quote from those experts and then persuade your audience that logically, if this many people who are experts agree, then we must also agree or disagree with their conclusions. Also, you should demonstrate that the conclusion follows from the premise. Essentially, what this comes down to is being organized. You want to help your readers move from point to point with clear transitions. You want to show how each idea connects and not leave any random points unsupported or unconnected. Being organized also contributes to a sense of you having good ethos. Your audience will trust your argument the more organized you are, and they're going to accept it more easily if it's presented logically. You also want to signal your conclusion clearly with words like finally, consequently, therefore, thus, ultimately, or as a result. These keywords will show readers the direction and movement of your argument. We'll continue working on identifying and developing all the different appeals of the rhetorical triangle, both in your research and in your writing this semester. For now, I want you to remember that many texts, and for our purposes this week, many ads, will use all the appeals at once, even though one might be the most prominent. So for the previous slides with the ads, I intentionally picked ethos, pathos, and logos as dominating each one of those ads. But many ads will actually have all three of them together, and you yourself will be using them all together in your writing. So in this particular example, by way of conclusion, I want you to look at how the three are working. Ethos is first in the celebrity figure, which is clearly the most prominent image. Ellen's credibility is supposed to be that she's trustworthy and likable, and that reputation is supposed to transfer to the product. You also have combined brand names here with CoverGirl and Olay put together, and those names of those particular companies are supposed to be well known and trustworthy, and then by combining them, the product becomes even more reputable. Next is pathos. There's a small tagline that says the product is recommended by CoverGirls and dark circle experts. So the dark circle expert here is the raccoon who has the black face mask fur. And the humor is supposed to come through because Ellen's hugging this wild animal and promoting it as an expert on makeup when clearly it's not. So we're supposed to laugh at that, and Ellen herself, as a known comedian, also contributes some of that ethos to the pathos there. So we have a sense of warmth and laughter, and the raccoon is a relatively cute picture of a raccoon here. So he's huggable and nice, and all of these feelings that we might get transfer, hopefully, to the product. And then finally, at the very bottom in very small font, there's a list of little check marks here, and it's checking off the product's benefits. And if you get through the credibility and you get through the pathos and you still need some kind of persuasion, you can zero in at the bottom where it's trying to persuade you through logos that if you purchase this product, here are all the benefits and examples of things that it's going to do for you. And logically, you should buy this product because it has all of these benefits. So I think this ad is a really clear example of how many times an advertiser will incorporate all three of those appeals in order to try to really persuade you that this product is the best one. Now, in your own writing, you also will be incorporating all three of the appeals through your own credibility as a trustworthy writer, by doing your research and showing an unbiased opinion, by using a good tone that thinks through the emotions that you want to have your readers and viewers feel when they get to the end of your essays, and through using good evidence and statistics perhaps, or if not statistics and numbers, logical organization that will lead people through and persuade. This week, though, I would like you to just focus on creating the very first step for our ad analysis essay, and that is to pick an ad that you want to analyze. It could be a print ad or a TV spot for a video. The main thing is that it must include clear elements of popular culture. You should post it to the discussion board and answer the prompts that will be there, and we'll be brainstorming through the ad that you want to think about using in your final essay, the ad analysis. And in particular, which appeal do you think is the strongest in your ad, and which one do you think is the most effective to write about? So think about these things this week, and you can return to this lecture throughout the course of the semester as you continue learning how to identify and incorporate the rhetorical appeals into your own writing.